Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So in this one, we're going to be talking a little bit about Agamotto. Card has been out for the better part of a week now, and pre-release, this was one of the cards I was most excited about. So now that we've had a bit of time to get some hands-on experience with it, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think about the card and the best ways to be playing it and to not be playing it in Snap, because it's a pretty unique card doing things that we haven't really had before in the game. And I think in general, it warrants a bit of a discussion about how you want to go about playing these types of cards that are adding more cards to your deck. Because unlike pre-release, when a lot of people thought, well, this is just a card you can splash in a wide variety of decks, I think you might be able to get away with it, but I don't think that's actually the best way to make use of the card, at least after my experience messing around with it and trying a bunch of different decks. So we're going to talk a little bit about the card. Before we do that, though, there is a little bit of an update on the Sanctum Showdown bug stuff. If you weren't aware of this, there were some issues with the tickets in Sanctum Showdown not showing up properly, and they did deploy a patch yesterday to fix that issue, so make sure to update your game if you have not already, and they are rolling out a bit of compensation there. So everyone's getting 18 scrolls and 500 charms delivered to their inbox. There's also a bug where the weekend mission that is supposed to be for Isan is saying it is for Khonshu, so it's not something you can do, but they plan on rewarding all players the 200 tokens from that mission sometime next week, so don't worry too much about the weekend mission. So Agamotto is a pretty strong card, and it has been finding quite a bit of success so far in Marvel Snap. And all the cards he is adding to your deck all do pretty strong things. But the main thing I have realized in testing a lot of different stuff with Agamotto is you really need to be building your deck in a way to maximize the power of Images of Icon. Though he gives you 4 spells, 3 of these 4 spells are pretty much always useful, or at least useful the majority of the time. So we have the 4 spells here. Let's talk a bit about the power of the spells. Winds of Watum is the obvious, it's just almost always good spell. You're essentially, at worst, playing a 2/5, and at best, you can be clogging the opponent's lane or surprising their final power output in a way that they don't really expect on the final turn of the game. So this is one where it is almost always good. The only time I found myself having this card in hand and not really liking it is when you have priority going into turn 2 and your opponent hasn't played a card yet. That's really the only time where I'm like, okay, this card's not really doing anything. Most of the time, it does something, and that something is quite good. So for that reason, I think it might be the best just on its own spell of the spells here, because it is just good the vast majority of the time. Then Bolts of Balthak is another really good one, where this one lets you do incredibly powerful things. It's like a super juiced up Psylocke. You're taking off either your whole turn on turn 3 or a lot of your turn later in the game, so you can have a really explosive turn on the turn after. And that's a pretty strong thing to do, especially if you're doing it on the end turn of the game, because it makes your power output a lot less predictable from your opponent, which is always good for cube equity. The downside of this card is essentially, well, sometimes you don't have a hand that can really take advantage of all that excess energy. So this is a card that definitely influences the deck building of Agamotto decks, and I've found that most of the Agamotto decks I've played, you want to have a fairly substantial top end of 4 or higher cost cards, so you can really take advantage of the extra energy that Bolts provides. This is one where sometimes it does really, really strong things, ramping out a bunch of big cards at the same time, but there are also a fair amount of times where you have it sitting in hand, and if you don't really have any payoffs to take advantage of that extra energy, it doesn't really do anything. So this one has a pretty high variance to how good or bad it ends up being in a given situation, and that's something you can mitigate by putting more high-cost cards in your deck. Temporal Manipulation, this is the simplest one of the bunch. I think one of the really strong things about this card is the fact that you have a larger deck, right? The big downside of Agamotto is you are sacrificing consistency for the ability to get to play these powerful spell or skill cards. And I think that's an interesting trade-off. And the thing with temporal manipulation is, well, it's kind of like a 1-3. As long as you're playing the Agamotto, you're essentially paying 1 energy to get 3 power, which that's not a bad rate at all. But the real important thing that this card is doing, I think, is it's thinning your deck. As long as the Agamotto isn't in your hand, it is a 1-3 draw card. And that is pretty great. Even if you end up in a situation where you don't play the Agamotto, playing a 1-0 draw card in a deck that is naturally larger than normal Snap decks is not a bad thing to be doing. And it has the benefit of being so cheap, you can very easily weave it in to a lot of your different turns, or just play it out on turn 1 if you don't have anything else to do. So this one I find is just very, very flexible. It helps make your deck a little bit more consistent by drawing a card, and it's decent power for the rate. Really, the only downside with this card is it does nothing on the final turn of the game if you are not playing down or have an Agamotto down. But that seems to be a pretty acceptable downside relative to the upside the card is providing. And then images. So images is the big one because the other 3 all work in a wide variety of decks. Bolts wants you to do a little bit of deck building around it to have some higher cost payoffs, but even with decks with a lot of cheaper cards, you can still get advantage out of Bolts a decent amount of the time. Images is the one that really says, okay, you kind of need to factor this into deck building because it is the highest cost spell, so it's going to be the one that takes up the most energy out of your turn, so you need it to have the biggest impact. It also is only coming down later in the game, and when you're in those later turns, it's competing with other powerful cards in terms of what you want to play on a given turn. So you really need this to make an impact, and a lot of times it does make an impact. I think this card is a huge reason why a lot of people are playing Shang-Chi again, because slamming down an Agamotto or another big threat in a lane, and then imaging it is like, okay, that usually is going to win the lane, unless they just kill all your big dudes with a Shang or something. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be that big of a dude. You can get very good value on things like Gwenpool or Galacta or Cassandra Nova, even some Rocket and Groots. Like, just getting copies of a powerful card is a really strong thing to do. But this is the one where it also has the biggest risk factor of you are dedicating the most amount of energy out of the spells, and it's all committing in one lane. And unless you're using it on a card that can move or buff your hand, it's committing its power all to a singular lane. On top of that, this is the one that really requires good deck building the most, because you need to have some smaller cards on the board that you don't mind going away to upgrade into these powerful threats. For that reason, I think that Sam Wilson is going to be a mainstay in a lot of these Agamotto decks, because even though having a bigger deck makes you less likely to draw Sam Wilson, which is a natural downside, right? Because the shield is obviously better when you draw Sam, so you can take advantage of it. But just having the shield there as a free body to upgrade with images is really strong in its own right, because it doesn't require you actually drawing anything. It's always going to be there, which is really, really powerful. Another card that's worth mentioning that is really good with images and in general Agamotto is King Eitri. But now it's essentially a 1-2, draw a spell, and then after you've drawn the spell, you have no problem throwing it away to images into making it something much, much better. So those 2 cards are ones that I expect to be mainstays in the vast majority of Agamotto archetypes, either both of them or one or the other, depending on how much space the deck has relative to its other choices. But I think that is the biggest thing I've seen with Agamotto, is that you really need to build in a way to maximize images, because if you don't, there could be a lot of times you're just sitting with an images dead in hand, and that feels really bad. The trade-off of getting these extra powerful spells in exchange for the less consistent deck has been very interesting, and I think it is a strong thing to do in the right deck, but I don't think Agamotto is just going to be this, oh, you can just jam it in any deck, and the spells are so strong that they can kind of carry him being there. I think there are a number of decks that much prefer to have that smaller deck size to have that added consistency of getting their best cards more often than having access to the powerful tools Agamotto provides. So I think it's important to really take a deep look at that and say, hey, this is a deck that can really benefit from it and doesn't really care about the downside quite as much as the benefit, versus this is a deck I would rather just have more consistency in. I think a really good example of a deck like that is the Ajax Affliction archetype. That deck's super strong. The cards here, I could totally see them work fairly well in Ajax, but in general, Ajax has a bit less room for the types of cards that let you benefit from images more, in terms of just small cards that you can upgrade and big threats to upgrade into. And probably most importantly, you are reducing your consistency of finding your best card in deck, which is like Ajax and the Hazmat combo with it, or other key Affliction cards in their respective matchups. So I think that's an important thing to realize with this card, is that it's not just a freebie. It's not Sam Wilson. It's not Iron Patriot. Those were cards that just stood so strong on their own and didn't really have much of a downside at all, because at worst case, you're playing a 2-3, or in Sam's case, a 2-4 or a 0-1. So there really wasn't a downside to adding those cards to your deck very much at all. And with Agamotto, from what I have played, there is definitely a downside to putting this card in your deck, especially if it is not built the right way. But if it is built the right way, I do think that even with the less consistent draws, the powerful things the spells are doing really can make up for that in the proper decks. So, speaking of decks, let's take a look at the decks actually playing this card. Now, these are the larger samples we have from Untapped, and very important disclaimer here. There is not a whole ton of Untapped data yet. So the most data we have is from the just general pool. And that includes pre-infinite, and that includes bots. So personally, I would not be looking at the statistics of win rate and cube rate for these decks as a really valid metric yet. The reason I'm bringing these up is not because of the stats on them, but it's really to just give you more of an idea of the ways people are trying out this card, and I want to provide some thoughts on if those are effective ways of doing so or not. So these are the 6 most popular ones on Untapped right now. You have an Arsham Doom version running Isan and Agamotto. You have a Thanos version that I believe was popularized by Crazy, well-known high ladder Thanos player. You have a Black Knight version. This one I actually played on stream myself and liked quite a bit, also running Isan. Then we have 2 other alterations of the Thanos version, but it's really the same deck, just give or take 1 or different card choice. So Thanos definitely seems to be the one that has been very, very popular for people, which honestly does surprise me a little bit, because Thanos naturally already has that bigger deck size, so I am kind of surprised to see that so many people are putting him in Thanos, because Thanos is going to see the spells on average even less, and it's going to dilute finding your best cards even more. On top of that, it's also much weaker to cards like Gorgon and Cassandra Nova, which are shaping up to be big parts of the metagame. So very curious to see if that sticks around long term, as personally, I haven't been super high on Thanos in Agamotto. And then we have the Werewolf deck, running some of the Victoria Hand stuff. There are a few different versions of this list. I think this was one of the more early ones. A lot of the newer ones seem to be dropping Zabu in favor of Nico, as well as potentially adopting things like Gorgon to help fend off opposing Agamotto spells. Now, we do have some post-infinite data that is separate from all the bots, but as you can see, these sample sizes are incredibly low. So again, I really wouldn't be looking at the win rate and cube rates here as super meaningful metrics. This is more just to continue to get an idea of how people are going about playing the card. So we see Thanos showing up some more, but we also see different ways of playing it here. One is the Mockingbird Sasquatch style of Wiccan. Personally, I'm not a believer in Agamotto Wiccan. I played that quite a bit, and I've found that Wiccan is a card that really values that extra draw consistency that Agamotto naturally gives you much less of. When you do get the Wiccan, it's great. It does work out really well. But the thing is, you're getting the Wiccan so much less often than on average you are in non-Agamotto Wiccan decks that I think you're basically better off playing a list just like this, but substituting out the Quicksilver and the Wiccan for better cards. And that's effectively what I did in one of the decks I climbed to Infinite with using Agamotto. It started out as a Wiccan deck, and then I realized, well, Wiccan wasn't happening nearly enough, but Sasquatch, Mockingbird, Mysterio stuff was pretty good. A lot of the other cards were pretty good. So just dropping the Wiccan out of that deck in favor of just some more generic good stuff cards felt a lot better to me in that kind of shell. There's also been some experimentation with Sentry and Nihilist stuff in this kind of deck. I'm not too high on that one, mainly because Sentry and Nihilist stuff does value getting those specific 2-card combos a lot, and by virtue of having a bigger deck, you're just not going to get them quite as often. Agamotto does let you do some surprising things with it. For example, if you ramp out and get that extra energy, you can slam Sentry and Annie on the same turn, or Sentry and Viper on the same turn, take your opponent by surprise, make it harder for them to be able to clog up that lane to block your Void. So that is a cool thing he enables, but I just think it is a bit more fragile when you don't get those specific pieces together compared to the more generic versions of these Wolf Agamotto decks that we've been seeing. And then there's another version of Arsham here. This one drops Doom in favor of just some more regular cards. Actually running Zola in this one to get more value out of their big 6-drops like Blob, Mockingbird, Isan, etc. And I do think that Agamotto in Arsham, I don't know if it's optimal or not, but Arsham just has so little consistency in terms of that draw RNG because the deck is the biggest deck in the game, that I think it can afford to get away with running Agamotto without feeling as diluted as a normal 12-card deck does. Also being able to tutor up Agamotto for 1 energy and play it a turn early, using images a turn early, like having that 1 extra energy does feel like it goes a long way with the Agamotto spells. So I can definitely see a real use case for it in Arsham, but it's unclear to me if that's going to be like objectively the best way to play Arsham or not going forward, but it's certainly not bad. So what are the standout Agamotto decks from my time with the card? These are the 5 lists that I have played the most of and I have felt the most confident recommending. And you'll probably notice that between some of these decks, there is a decent amount of overlap. I mean, Kate Bishop is in almost all of these decks, except for the Arsham deck. Iron Patriot in almost all of these decks. Sam Wilson in almost all of these decks. Agamotto really rewards, I think, good cards strategies. And especially, like previously mentioned, things with like Sam Wilson giving you something to just transform away with the images. The hood is a nice thing for that as well. You can throw away the hood with your misery or with your images to get a much bigger threat out of it. You also notice that Shang has become a very, very prevalent card in the metagame. Not super surprising when you release 2 10-power cards in a week. We'll see if that sticks around, but I do think as long as Agamotto is prevalent, Shang is probably going to be pretty prevalent as well. But these are the ones I've liked a lot. I think Gorgon has been getting a lot of value as Agamotto decks tick up in popularity. So I have liked that as a anti-Agamotto splash, because sometimes just turning their spell to be 1 turn slower can be pretty backbreaking, especially since a lot of them are also running card generation with things like Kate and Iron Patriot, and some even go more all in on the card generation, or just to hose Arsham a bit, who I also think is one of the strong decks for Agamotto. I haven't played enough with Thanos to personally recommend that one. That one I think I still need some more time with because there's a lot more variance with Thanos. And like I said before, I think Thanos is going to get caught up in a bit of collateral damage where people are going to start playing more cards and decks to hate on things like Agamotto and Arsham. And then Thanos gets caught in the crossfire due to more Cassandra Novas, more Gorgons, maybe more Darkhawks being around in the metagame. The first, second, and fifth list here are very just solid mid-range stat piles. We're either putting out a lot of stats or have some good ways of interacting with the board or both. So I think that's a really good way to go with Agamotto. Zoo is probably the weakest of the bunch here, but it is one I did still enjoy with Agamotto, mainly because Zoo gets the added benefit of it's already doing the thing of spamming the board with a bunch of small stuff, which is a nice payoff for the images. And it can benefit a lot from all the spells without really disrupting its own game plan too much. And then Arsham's just still very, very strong. You could play it with or without Dooms. I personally liked it better with the Dooms. Being able to images a Doom is just really, really backbreaking sometimes, whether that be 2099 or original Doctor Doom. Alioth shutting down what your opponents are doing on the final turn or even turn 5 is very strong, though you do have to be mindful of the fact that Alioth does not snipe spells, so don't forget that. But yeah, these are the lists I have found to be very successful with this card, and can really benefit from the things Agamotto is doing without really taking too much downside from the lack of consistency due to the bigger deck size. And as these Agamotto decks continue to rise in popularity and get more refined, I think we'll start to see more dedicated counter decks on the horizon. On stream the other day, I ended up trying out a Darkhawk Gorgon Cassandra deck and found that one to be pretty strong in the current environment, where a lot of people are just jamming Agamotto decks because it's a fun new card that does interesting things. So we'll see how it goes as the metagame develops, but if you're looking for some very solid, tested, proven Agamotto decks, these are the type of lists that I think you want to be going for. But yeah, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below about Agamotto. Have you been liking the card? What do you think about it? I'd love to hear it. And as always, links for these decks will be in the description if you want to import them into the game for yourself. But I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.